everyone. So I don't know how many of you have done podcasts before. So if you haven't done one, this may be the first time you are listening to a lecture without a person in front of you. And from my side, it's really weird to talk to a computer as if I'm really in front of a group of students, but I'm not. Well, either way, let's get through this to the best of our abilities. But no matter whether this is a real-time lecture or recorded, it will be equally important in your exams and for the completion of your coursework. So the lecture is going to be on water pollution, mainly focusing on fresh water, right? You know what causes pollution and what kind of effects comes up aftermath of pollution. Okay, now so what is water pollution? By definition, it is any physical, biological, or chemical change in the water quality that can adversely impact the living organisms and the physical habitat of water. Of course, when the physical habitat of water, the water column itself, the bottom, the surface, when any of those components of a water body physically gets impacted, it could be due to changes in temperature, changes in the chemical composition, changes in the dissolved oxygen concentration, that will eventually impact the water, and that will any impact on water physically or chemically will lead to biological impacts. In other words, that will hamper the development, growth, reproduction, and general biological activities of organisms living in that water. And from a human standpoint, you can also say, like mentioned over here in the definition, that when water is impacted by pollution, it may affect drinking, it may affect any of the uses. It could be, it may no longer be available for recreational based use, for example for swimming and boating, and polluted water may not be used for irrigation. So if a particular water is extremely polluted, you will never use it for any of these conditions. But certain water bodies may be suitable for recreation but not for drinking. Certain water bodies may be suitable for irrigation but not for drinking. That depends on what pollutes water, and we will come to certain examples later on. So basically, what is pollution? It's any physical, biological, or chemical change in the water quality that adversely impact living organisms, and also making water unsuitable for different desired uses. Now, water pollution itself, the word itself is not artificial. It's not something always induced by human activities. Naturally, the runoff happens after rainfall, after snow melts. So if the runoff coming directly from rainfall or from snow melt may run across exposed mineral beds. What is a mineral bed? It's like a salt deposition that is exposed to the environment from the soil. So if water runs over these mineral beds, and when water runs on exposed soil, erosion happens, and subsequent to erosion, the water dumps into lakes and streams, any natural water body. So those water bodies receive sediments and many dissolved pollutants, dissolved minerals. So that happens naturally to a certain degree. And there are oil that sometimes, if it is too superficial, oil can actually leak from the oil deposits and gets into water. That happens in the deep ocean once in a while, very rarely actually. And on the other hand, there are many microbial activities that is operating within the water bodies that can also lead to substantial changes in water quality. Speaking of such microbial activities, you may recall in one of our discussions we talked about a particular dinoflagellate that actually periodically blooms and results in substantial change of water quality. Remember, if you could remember, it changes the color of water. But the story that I want you to learn is that natural water pollution happens to a minimal degree. It's not very frequent, it's quite infrequent, and the change of water quality most often does not bewilder the human consumption, and it may not bring really adverse impacts on the living organisms. And most importantly, natural pollution, since impacts are minor, on top of that, the natural biogeochemical cycles, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, those cycles and biological organisms living in the water column, they can actually remediate for these minor impacts. So natural pollution, you can say it's well taken care of. What we have to worry about is the pollution that is resulted by human activities. Okay, now I'm trying to get the pointer here so it's easy for me to point out things. Okay, so now let's talk about different sources of pollution. First, point source, and the other one is non-point source. Let's talk about point source pollution first. Um, when pollutants are discharged into water bodies from a specific location, such as factories, industries, power plants, drainage pipes, and generally, every drain pipe that empties pollutants from a factory, from an industry into a water body. Now that pollutant that is drained in, that is being dumped to water, is known as industrial effluvia. Okay. um, and I can go on with the list of potential point source pollutants: sewer treatment plants, oil wells, coal mines. So anywhere or in any situation where you can specifically identify the location where pollutants are discharged, specifically where pollution is happening, that source of pollution is known as a point source pollution. Literally, you should be able to point on a map, point on a particular location and say, hey, that's where pollution is happening. Now that is a point source that is a point source pollution. um, So, like I said, yeah, point source pollutants are discharged to a natural water body from a specific location at a specific point, and there's draining happens through pipes, through ditches, through canals, through sewer lines. Um, since point source pollution is location specific, right? It happens at a given specific place. um, it's really easy to identify point sources of pollution, and because of that you can easily monitor the extent of damage, the degree of pollution, and therefore it's really easy to regulate and to mitigate the effects of pollution. So in fact, most of the today, well, historically this was a huge problem, but today I think in the developing countries particularly, control of point source pollution has been successful, and then in many developing countries that has really good environmental management plans, controlling point source. Okay, the other type, non-point sources. So as the word implies, the source of pollution is scattered, diffused all over the environment, all over a particular area, a particular region. There is no specific point location of discharge, not like a drain pipe, not like a sewer canal. So examples, consider runoff, washing over agricultural fields, croplands, feedlots, livestock farms, well, golf courses, um, home gardens, lawns, construction sites, forest areas that's undergoing logging, any kind of infrastructure development like road construction, road repair. Parking lots has been recognized as an important non-point source non-point source of pollution. Many residential areas, well, any impervious layer or any agricultural field that does not practice soil preservation can consider as a source of non-point source pollution. Um, so what happens under this situation? Well, the runoff that comes from rainfall washes over the land, carries sediments, soil, salt, fertilizers, many agrochemicals, pesticides, and if, bacteria, pathogens, viruses, and excess salts, all of those from those developed altered landscapes, and dump that contents, dump those pollutants into the water body. Now in this slide you see the excess salts. Now you may wonder where salts come from. Well, primarily you may recall the fact that exposed mine beds, exposed salt deposits. Well, other than that, consider what you do in winter. What does the state transport departments or county officers do at the onset of snowfall or at the onset of winter, particularly in the northeast and midwest? Well, they put salt, road salt, on the ground to delay the melting point of the freezing point of water, so that the ice and snow will not accumulate on the ground. That will hamper transportation and make hazardous conditions under snow. So those road salts are known to consider substantial impacts on regional wetlands, vernal pools, and food processing wastes. Well, that's also, we will talk much more detail about that, coming out of food processing areas. You know, if there is no proper point discharge, that could be happening. So after heavy rainfall, or when the snow melts, that melting snow or that water can flush high amounts of gasoline that's on the road, that leached out of motor vehicles, lead that was actually considered a component of gasoline, oil, and many other adverse compounds from city streets, and that can be ended up with the runoff in nearby wetlands, lakes, or river. Unlike point source pollution, point source pollution is specific and it's predictable. Non-point source pollution is unpredictable, it's episodic, it happens probably at the onset of snow melt, at the onset of rainfall, storm. So it's very unpredictable and very episodic, happens in certain time of the year. So because of that nature, simply because of you cannot point to it, it's really difficult to monitor and regulate. It's really difficult to enforce environmental management regulations and policies to mitigate non-point source pollution. Okay, now we'll continue on non-point source pollution. Atmospheric deposition is an extreme form of non-point source pollution. Now, how does this happen? Well, pollutants, or I sometimes use the word contaminants, kind of for your level it's okay to consider contaminants as the same as pollutants. So contaminants carried by air currents can be blown away from the source of production, and it will be taken somewhere totally away, totally outside the area of production, and kept in the atmosphere. And with rainfall, such contaminants can come back to the surface of the earth, to the water levels, to the watersheds, to different parts of natural water bodies, in forms of rain, snow, or even as dry deposits. We talked about dry deposits when we discussed effects of mercury contamination. So the same thing happens here. For example, in the United States, there are EPA, Environmental Protection Agency's estimates, which says there's about over 600,000 kilograms of atrazine, an herbicide, and PCB levels in the Great Lake areas of the northern US. So, well, you know about atrazine. It's an herbicide that's very widely used within the US and many other parts of the country due to its success as getting rid of many um, competing herbs that can grow in croplands. Now, you may not know about PCB very much, but you might have heard about it because it's a major pollutants in the freshwater bodies, particularly lakes of the United States, not only in the Midwestern Great Lake areas, but even in many of the constructed reservoirs in the southeastern US. So what are PCB? Well, PCBs stands for polychlorinated biphenyls. You don't have to know that, I just mentioned that for your knowledge. PCB, the acronym is perfectly acceptable. Well, PCBs belong to a broad family of man-made organic chemicals. Now these PCBs were manufactured within the United States in factories. It started, I think, around 1929, 1930s, and it was carried on until their production is banned within the United States. So PCBs have a range of toxicity that vary in consistency, the chemical form varying from light colored liquids to yellow, dark black waxy solids. PCBs are generally non-flammable. They don't catch fire easily. They are very stable chemically, which actually, because of that chemical stability, PCBs can actually bioaccumulate, bioconcentrate along food chains. And PCBs also have very high boiling points, so they do not boil easily. They do not transform their phases very easily. And they are quite resistant to electricity conduct, so they have insulatory properties. So because of all those properties I just mentioned, PCBs were initially used in hundreds and thousands of industries and commercial applications, mainly focusing on manufacturing of electrical and electronic equipment, on heat transferring processes, for hydraulic equipment, in manufacturing paints, plastics, rubber products, pigments, dyes, carbonless copy papers, just another kind of copy paper, and so for many of those applications. And mostly PCB was largely used in the electric and electronic industry. Well, that's something about PCB. So what happens here, in atmospheric deposition is things like these PCBs and atrazine that can be evaporated, that can be released to the atmosphere, or could accumulate on land and then wash on rainfall, deposit somewhere else, evaporate from wherever it deposits, evaporating it into the atmosphere, getting into the atmosphere, carried away by air currents, winds, and then depositing elsewhere again as rainfall. There are many instances where contaminants have evaporated from lakes and rivers and has been deposited elsewhere. One example that's very neat, I thought, was coming from Western Ghats of India. Western Ghats is a biodiversity-rich mountain range located on the western coast of the Indian subcontinent. It spans from the southernmost tip of India to all the way up to the Himalayan range. In a research conducted in the springs, rivers, streams, and wetlands of Western Ghats cloud forests, a group of scientists figured that there are high concentrations of pesticides in those waterways. Now, these wetlands and forests of Western Ghats cloud forests are located miles and miles, hundreds and thousands of miles away from any nearby croplands. So they tracked down what is the closest cropland, and by multiple kinds of atmospheric modeling and sampling, they figured these pesticides comes from actually lowland crop fields that's lying beneath the mountains, and evaporated from there, carried for the wind currents, climbs up the mountain with the wind currents, and deposits within the cloud forest areas through rainfall and through fog condensation. So it's a really cool example where A completely protected forest, a conservation land got impacted by pollution or rising from croplands miles and miles away. So it's a good example for how adverse non-point source pollution can be, how adverse or how critical atmospheric depositions can be when it comes to environmental impacts of pollution. Okay, now one of the most important aspects of water pollution or impacts of water pollution, particularly if we were to talk about human health, is contamination of drinking and consumable water with waterborne pathogens. The main source of waterborne pathogens is coming from disposing improperly treated or untreated human wastes, well, specifically feces and urine, from sewage systems and from animal waste systems, from animal feedlots and fields, from those areas to waterways, to natural waterways. Over 90% of the population in the developing nations have a very good, well-developed, multiple-scale sewage treatment systems. One of them you have already observed, and there are ones in the rest of the country that are much better in terms of treating wastewater, treating sewer water. Now, because of these systems, over 95 to nearly 99% of population gets safe drinking water in developed nations. Now, the condition is completely flipped in the developing countries. About 2.5 billion people in developing nations do not have access to good sanitary facilities. Because of that, half of the population from developing countries do not have access to clean drinking water. The reason is the sewage treatment facilities, constructing the facility and maintaining the facility is quite expensive, right? So the developing nations may not be able to afford to keep those up and running. And whenever you see sewer treatment plants, those are very primitive, right? And sometimes it doesn't exist. And in certain situations, people directly actually, they may not have bathrooms, they may not have restroom, toilets. Their toilet, their restroom is the nearby pond, the nearby lake, the nearby river. So the situation is so dire, certain waterways, can't even be accessed without getting poop all over your feet if you try to walk to the waterway. It's that bad in certain parts of the world, particularly India and many southern sub-Saharan African nations. Now, let's talk about a few of these waterborne diseases. Well, I don't expect you to know greater detail about this, but I want you to know, a couple of important names of these diseases and how you get them. There's a list over here. Typhoid fever, cholera, bacterial and amoeboid dysentery, infectious hepatitis. You know why infectious hepatitis? There are several forms of hepatitis. One form is in fact transmitted by sexual intercourse. We are here only talking about the form that is transmitted by water and food. And schistosomiasis. I'll take a few of those examples. Now remember, most of the waterborne diseases are induced by bacteria, infective bacteria, and some of them are by virus. For example, the hepatitis forms are in fact virus induced. Schistosomiasis is in fact caused by a protozoan, something quite similar to amoebas. Not an amoeba itself, but something similar to that. So let's talk about typhoid fever a little over here. So if you need more examples or more information about these diseases, the World Health Organization website and the CDC, Center for Disease Control website, provide a copious amount of information. Now, Typhoid fever is in fact a very life-threatening illness that is caused by a bacterium known as Salmonella typhi. Do not have to memorize that. So, where do you get these diseases? Of course, like I just mentioned, most of those diseases are not prevalent in the developing countries. United States, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, you don't get these diseases. Most of the Americans who have contracted typhoid fever got it when they travel internationally in developing countries. It says, statistics say that about 21.5 million people in the developing countries are affected by typhoid fever annually. Now, typhoid fever, how do you get typhoid fever? Well, Salmonella typhi, the bacterium, lives only in humans and humans only. So, people who are suffering from typhoid fever carry the bacteria in their bloodstream and in the intestinal tract, in your gut. How do you get it from a person who's already ill? Well, if your food or your drinking water gets contaminated by body fluids, particularly blood or feces of an infected person, yeah, there's a good chance of you contracting typhoid fever. You can get typhoid fever if you eat food or drink beverages that have been handled by a person who's literally shedding Salmonella bacteria, or if fever is contaminated with that particular bacteria that gets into your drinking or consumable water. So that's why typhoid fever is much more common in the areas of the world where sanitary practices like hand washing is less frequent, and where you don't have severe treatment capacities. And once a healthy person ingests Salmonella bacteria through water or through food, the bacteria multiplies in the gut first, then penetrates the digestive tract wall, gets into the bloodstream, and can go all over the body, and can result in really painful situations. For example, it could create a mild to severe headaches, very high fever, weaknesses, inability to remain active, headaches. You can suffer from headaches, severe diarrhea, sometimes internal bleeding. We use the term hemorrhage for that. Enlargement of the spleen and the liver, which are two vital organs in your body, and so healthy carrier state may actually follow acute illnesses. So the conditions are very acute. You immediately get to observe the results of your infection, and the good news is it can be treated through antibiotics, and of course through practicing sanitary health work, and of course having proper severe treatment can be a good countermeasure for these diseases, not only for this, for many of the other diseases. Okay, now about cholera. Cholera is also an acute intestinal infection caused by ingestion of food or water contaminated by a pathogenic bacterium known as Vibrio cholera. This bacteria has a very short incubation period, could range from less than 24 hours to 4 or 5 days, and this bacteria, that once it enters your digestive system, they secrete a particular toxin called enterotoxin that results in severe but painless diarrhea, where you literally poop water, which means you are losing tremendous amount of water through your digestive system from your body. So you immediately, quickly, within hours if not days, you you suffer from severe dehydration, you lose your water, and you lose essential mineral ions from your body, and the death is imminent if proper treatments are not given. And vomiting is also recorded from many patients who suffer from cholera. Okay, the last one, schistosomiasis. There's one. Okay, schistosomiasis is a disease that is also observed in developing nations suffering from extreme poverty, not any developing nation, that leads to chronic ill conditions, chronic health impacts. Now, in the previous two cases, they were acute. This is a chronic situation, so this lasts longer upon infection. How do you acquire the infection? Well, infection is acquired when people come into contact with fresh water that is contaminated or infested by a particular larval form of a protozoan. This particular protozoan is in fact a blood fluke or a blood worm. And those animals, those little troublesome flukes, are known as cystosomes. So these microscopic bloodworms, the adult worms, live in the veins draining from urinary tract and intestines, particularly from many mammals, including humans. And most of the eggs these worms lay are trapped within the tissues of the human body, and then the body reacts to those eggs and other life stages of the worm, and that reaction coming from your own body for your own protection can be massive, ginormous, and could be severely damaging to many organs and systems and many processes of your body. This infection is prevalent in tropical and subtropical areas, in poor communities without potable water and adequate sanitation. Like I mentioned, this starts from the urinary tract, from the urogenital system, that actually excretes the urine produced in your body. Well, of course, this condition is also treatable, but the problem is, it cannot be mitigated successfully unless these communities are provided with good sanitary facilities. So you may ask, how do you get this worm into your urinary system? Well, long story short, for the completion of the life cycle of this parasitic fluke, this blood fluke, it requires another host other than humans. Well, to be specific, they need freshwater snails to complete certain life stages. So, and where do those snails live in? Well, they live in water. So if an infected person contaminates a freshwater body with this host snail with infected urine, well, the snails gets infected and complete the life cycle, and then can be reinfect humans who consumes the contaminated water. Now, other than those direct infective diseases, there are several vector-borne diseases that are caused by insect vectors from biting midges, biting flies, and mosquitoes. Malaria mosquitoes. The vector of the malaria mosquito breeds in water contaminated, polluted by organic wastes. Well, organic waste? Feces. And again, it's not the mosquito itself creating the medical complication. It's again a parasitic microscopic protozoan known as Plasmodium that creates this disease condition that infects the circulatory system and the liver of infected individuals. Couple of more situations is yellow fever and filariasis, and you may have heard about a mosquito-borne disease that produces huge elephant-like limbs in humans. Well, again, that situation is carried by is given to you by a mosquito, a vector mosquito, known as filaria mosquitoes that harbors a parasitic nematode, a worm inside the mosquito's body. When the mosquito drinks your blood, um, the parasitic larvae gets into your bloodstream from the vector mosquito, goes into your blood, travels to many parts of your tissues and get trapped in your body. When a particular parasite is trapped in your body reacts by producing fibrous tissues around it to prevent it from moving around, going into vital parts of your body. And the growth or this reaction coming from your body by depositing many fibrous tissues is massive. So therefore, if this parasite is trapped. Now let's continue talking about more about the presence of bacteria in water. Well, and how that impacts the water quality parameters, particularly oxygen, one of the most important elements, constituents of water that will enhance its biodiversity and its suitability for consumption. Well, water bodies that has oxygen concentrations greater than 6 parts per million will actually support greater diversity of aquatic lives, particularly not only smaller life forms but also large life forms like fish, amphibians, and large invertebrates that actually extracts dissolved water from the dissolved oxygen from water. Well, if a particular in a water body, if the oxygen concentration drops below 2 parts per million, that cannot support large organisms. Okay, the most of the organisms that you are going to find in a water body with oxygen concentration lower than 2 parts per million is going to be mainly detritivores and decomposers, right? And who are those? Bacteria, fungus, and worms, and certain other smaller insects. Now, why you cannot have a larger organism? Well, larger organisms have large bodies, many cells, and every living cell in an organism demands oxygen. Well, almost every cell, not literally every cell. So if you have many oxygen demand, if you have a greater oxygen demand, you have to have a greater oxygen content in the water. If it is below 2 ppm, you're not going to get enough. Alright, so that's why, now you know why poorly oxygenated water has less life, or rather fewer diversity of larger organisms. Now, what contaminates water with bacteria and what cause reduction in dissolved oxygen concentration? Organic wastes. Example, well, you already know the example: sewage, food waste, livestock waste, right? All of those of course are rich in organic matter, right, and also rich in nitrates and phosphates. Now, organic matter provides food or directly energy for microorganisms, and nitrogen and phosphate provide nutrients that is required for those microorganisms to multiply, to increase in number, to reproduce, to grow. So contamination of water with organic waste such as feces lead to increased concentration of bacteria in water, simply because bacteria will keep multiplying in matter of hours, in matter of days, due to the rich supply of food and nutrients. So you may think right now a particular bacteria that can thrive in fecal contaminated waters. Well, fecal coliform bacteria that you have already cultured in those petri dishes, and you already know how quickly they grew on the growth medium. So they definitely can multiply, but it's not only the fecal coliform bacteria that can actually multiply when water is contaminated by feces. Many other forms of decomposers can too. Can think about certain examples over here, right? Well, of course, many forms of coliform and non-coliform bacteria, many planktons, algae, cyanobacteria, all of those can actually capitalize from the rich supply of food and nutrients. So what do those decomposers do? Well, remember, algae and cyanobacteria are not decomposers, right? So decomposers are bacteria and fungus. So those decomposers will actually keep consuming the oxygen. Why? For what? Well, decomposition is a respiration-like process. Remember what happens in respiration? Well, you break down complex organic matter into carbon dioxide and water when you extract energy from the organic matter to fuel essential biological processes. So decomposition is extremely similar to, quite similar to respiration, very similar biochemically as well as the general process wise. So lots of organic matter in water increases bacteria who will continue breaking down the organic waste and keep consuming oxygen to such a level it decreases below 2 ppm, 2 parts per million. Now this brings into a very good metric that you need to learn when you assess water quality: biological oxygen demand. Remember, in your laboratory exercise, using a titration, you determined the oxygen concentration in the water body. So based on similar techniques, you can actually measure the biological oxygen demand. What does that mean? That is the demand of oxygen set by decomposing microorganisms. So if you have a very high biological oxygen demand, if you measure very high values of biological oxygen demand, you are looking at a blooming community of decomposers, a blooming community of bacteria, which indicates possibility of that water body being contaminated by organic waste. So BOD, measuring BOD is the acronym for biological oxygen demand. So measuring BOD tells you a lot about the water quality. Okay, here I'm going to introduce you to a new concept in water pollution regarding the declining oxygen concentration with increasing organic pollution. So the concept is organic sag, like I show you over here. Now, what is organic sag? Essentially, that means the declining concentration of dissolved oxygen downstream from a particular pollution source as a result of decomposers increasingly metabolizing organic waste by consuming dissolved oxygen, right, in that particular water body. So that's what oxygen sag is. Now let's look into details of this. Well, let's look at the picture. First, look at the clean zone. Well, in that clean zone area, you don't see any pollution happening in that region of the stream. And again, oxygen sag concept works perfectly for a flowing water system because of the flow of water from one point to another. This concept is applicable almost exclusively to flowing water. Now, clean zone, no pollution happening in that point upward, so there is very high oxygen concentration. Because of the high oxygen concentration above 6 parts per million, you get large fish like trouts, perch, bass, and many oxygen sensitive oxygen demanding organisms, insects like mayfly, stonefly, caddisfly larvae. So there is a large number of organisms living that environment, and so very few of decomposing microorganisms. So therefore there is lower biological oxygen demand. Over here they use the word biochemical oxygen demand, combining biological oxygen demand with chemical oxygen demand. So over here just concentrate on the part of the biological oxygen demand, which is the most useful water quality metric rather than the chemical oxygen demand. So because of that situation, because of the lower concentration of organic waste, there's fewer bacteria decomposing and using oxygen for decomposition process. So look at over here, the biological oxygen demand over here is very low, okay, but the dissolved oxygen concentration is quite high because there is little consumption for decomposition. And now right at this particular area, you can see a particular drain pipe dumping organic waste into the water body, right? So lots of organic waste, that means lot of food and nutrients for decomposing bacteria who starts multiplying, growing in number. As a result, the decomposition increases and therefore the biological oxygen demand rises. It peaks up. It peaks up so much now it is just a little below the available dissolved oxygen. As a result, the very high dissolved oxygen concentration that we had before pollution now declines in the decomposition zone. It is called decomposition zone because of extremely high degree of decomposition going on with the introduction of organic wastes into this stream. Now let's go a little bit more downstream. Now remember, at the decomposition zone the oxygen concentration is going down, so large fish are declining, right? Only fish that occur are those that can live in poor oxygen water, like this catfish you can see, which is very resistant. Catfishes are very resistant to water quality, to adverse water quality. They have high levels of tolerance. So next part, with that declining dissolved oxygen, right, you know, where the dissolved oxygen is just above and below 2 parts per million, it's too low. The oxygen concentration is too low for larger fish to occur, and it is too low for sensitive macroinvertebrates to prosper. So in this zone, which is known as the septic zone, you get absolutely no fish, and you may get sludge worms, midges, and mosquito larvae who can actually, you know, proliferate in polluted water, making use of the organic waste available. Now at this level you can see the biological oxygen demand now has fallen down, it has become lower as the organic waste is consumed by organisms. You know, it's removed from water, so there is little organic waste for bacteria to grow on. So because of that, there's going to be less bacteria now in the septic zone, right? So in the decomposition zone, going back, you can say it upshoots, you know, in a matter of seconds, and the BOD remained very high and then gradually declined within the decomposition zone as the microbacteria and other organisms keeps using the organic waste. So in the septic zone, what you are getting is very low concentrations of organic waste, quite low. It cannot sustain a larger number of bacteria. So now you are seeing a steady biological oxygen demand in the septic zone. Now let's move a little bit more downstream. Now because of the reduced bacterial decomposition, you know, the oxygen now rises back. How? Well, you may have some photosynthetic organisms occurring in the top of the water, or this is a river, so with the flow it mixes with atmospheric air, so dissolved oxygen concentration rises back now. So now still the oxygen concentration is below 6 ppm. You do not see many fish. You see certain trash fish that again can tolerate adverse oxygen concentrations. You may have some leech and some isopods. Isopods are some crustaceans that can tolerate low oxygen concentration. So this area, since the biologically available oxygen is increasing and the BOD has stabilized, we call this area the recovery zone. Let's move a little bit more downstream. Well, now the biological oxygen demand has gone above the 6 parts per million. It's rich enough to support large fish like trout, perch, bass, and it is also good for occurrence of sensitive macroinvertebrates, sensitive insect larvae like mayfly, stonefly, caddisfly, and so on and so forth. So what this means is, as the water flows from the point of pollution onwards downstream, a stream undergoes, you know, rapid decline of dissolved oxygen and a rapid increment of biological oxygen demand, and then as the stream flows down, if no pollution takes place downstream, it could recover by many biological activities. Now think about this. What if there were many points of pollution, what if there are many drain pipes like this over and over and over on the same stream? Well, you can definitely assume, make a very educated guess that if the pollution keeps happening downstream, that stream may never recover. It may never get a recovery zone, it may never get a clean zone, because this sort of recovery of the oxygen sag happens only if there's ample distance, ample non-impacted water downstream. So the bottom line is, the stream can actually sustain certain degree of pollution. It will take the impact, it will take a hit, but the nature itself will clean the water as it flows downstream. And the higher the volume of water, the better chance of recovery that particular stream has. And also remember, if pollution happens over and over, that stream may not recover ever before it gets into the ocean. Okay, now well, that's about water bodies getting contaminated with organic wastes. Well, what is the other flip side? Well, not necessarily the flip side. Another aspect of water pollution is water getting polluted by nutrients. And now you know well enough to think about those nutrients, nitrates and phosphates. Now remember, if a particular water body gets contaminated with human waste like sewer, definitely it's not only organic waste, you're also going to get lots of nitrates and phosphates when sewage contaminates a particular water source. Okay, first, what are different types of contamination of water bodies with nutrients? Well, first let's start at the lowest level of contamination, or particularly where a water body only gets nutrients by natural runoff, rainwater, snowmelt. Well, many lakes that has clear, transparent, blue, crystal blue water, those water bodies are known as oligotrophic lakes. Now those oligotrophic lakes have clear water simply because they don't have many planktons growing in that particular water body. Why? There aren't much nutrients, nitrates and phosphates for those planktons to grow. Because of that, water is transparent. In certain deep lakes you can almost see the bottom on a sunny day. So oligotrophic lakes if oligotrophic lakes have fewer planktons, fewer primary producers, you are looking at a lake that is low in biological productivity. The next level is eutrophic, where water is rich in organisms due to addition of nutrients and also due to addition of organic material. Certain organisms like planktons can grow, proliferate, so you will have a relatively higher elevated biological productivity in eutrophic water. The next level is in fact hypereutrophic. I'm not going to go into that detail. Now let's talk about the process of eutrophication. Eutrophication means, it stands for the process of increasing nutrient levels and biological productivity. Well, when you have more nutrients, more nitrates and phosphates running into a lake, to a wetland, to a river, the planktons, phytoplanktons, primary producers, those tiny teeny weeny primary producers, use those nutrients, multiply in number, increase in number, grow, and they increase the biological productivity of that water body. Now with that, the lake or that water body may lose its clearness, the clarity, the transparency of the water body, because microorganisms, when they proliferate, when planktons proliferate, when they increase in number, the water turns gradually greenish. Now, is eutrophication a complete anthropogenic process? Well, not exactly. With time, an oligotrophic lake over hundreds if not thousands of years, a lake can become eutrophic. That's a natural process. And in certain occasions, as you have learned during the very few initial lectures, a lake can get completely filled up, sedimented, and become a wetland, become a marsh because of eutrophication. How this happens, let me quickly explain how it happens if you don't remember our first few lectures. Well, a lake, when it gets nutrients, phytoplankton are going to grow. When they die, they are going to sediment in the bottom, and the runoff will bring in more sediment, soil, and it will fill up the bottom, and the lake will become shallower with the supply of nutrients. Even rooted vegetation now can grow in larger number, filling up the lake, and gradually actually filling up the lake, and making the lake a wetland, or rather a marsh. So that's actually a secondary successional process, which does not happen over a day or a two or a month. Usually it's centuries, if not more, right? So eutrophication is natural, it happens, right? But what is not natural, what is induced by human activities, is known as cultural eutrophication, which means increase in biological productivity of a water body due to human activities. For example, runoff coming from crop fields, agricultural fields, untreated or partially treated sewer, thermal effluvia, that means heated water flowing into water. I'll talk a little bit more about thermal effluvia later on, how it comes to be. And increased solar incidence. Now you know about agricultural runoff and you already learned about sewer. Let me talk a little bit of increased solar incidence and how humans are responsible for that. Usually forested lakes, they have a huge coverage of canopy around the forest, around the streams, around rivers. But with human development, well, not human development, with urban development, with residential and commercial development, people tends to clear those riparian forests and open up the canopy. That increases the solar radiation incidence to the water body, and guess who likes lots of sunlight? Well, phytoplankton. You are correct. So that's how increased solar incidence leads to cultural eutrophication. So cultural eutrophication is in fact human enhanced eutrophication, where human activities leads to increased addition of nutrients to a water body, leading to increased abundance of phytoplanktons and many photosynthetic organisms that utilize the provision of nutrients. Now you may ask me, well, lot more nutrients in water, this point, lot more nutrients in water, lot of good food for primary producers, for planktons, lots of food for zooplanktons. That means increasing biomass in every trophic level. So shouldn't it be a place rich in food, which means, you know, should be high in biodiversity, because it should be able to sustain lots of fish. Lots of fish that eats phytoplankton, lots of fish that eats zooplankton. Well, that's what you would think theoretically. And of course, if you manage eutrophication below cultural eutrophication level, if you keep it between eutrophic and oligotrophic level, yeah, definitely yes. But with cultural eutrophication, that's not going to happen. Let's explain. Let me explain why. Well, there's a particular process called algal blooms happening when cultural eutrophication takes place, which literally means algae, making use of the ample supply of nutrients, blooms, increasing in their numbers, abundance, smothering the surface water. Now what happens now? Well, algae, of course, during daytime they will photosynthesize, right? So they will supply oxygen during daytime to the communities below the surface water. But what happens during night time? There will be no oxygen supply. Now algae, who earlier produced oxygen, will consume oxygen, okay? And many other organisms living in the bottom of the water will also consume oxygen during night time, depleting the oxygen to very biologically low levels. And what happens when algae die? Well, they will sink to the bottom, and now you have decaying organic matter in the bottom of a lake or a water body. Now guess who loves decomposing organic matter? Yes, decomposing bacteria. They will keep depleting oxygen level. Well, in this way, oxygen gets gradually depleted from that water body, particularly during night times with the accumulation of dead plant and organic material. Well, animals also die. Why? During night time there's low oxygen for them to breathe, so they suffocate and they die, and their dead bodies accumulate in water. Good food for microorganisms, and they will keep consuming dissolved oxygen to critically low level. So algal bloom or cultural eutrophication definitely leads to oxygen depletion, and that of course is lethal for many biological organisms. Not only that, those decomposers, when the oxygen level goes critically low, starts releasing biologically harmful compounds, lethal gases. Specifically, if the oxygen level is near zero, certain bacteria switch into anaerobic respiration or anaerobic decomposition, which is also known as fermentation. That results in so many organic acids, organic compounds that are toxic for living organisms. And of course, in this occasion, certain lethal gases can also be released from decomposing organic matter. That ultimately, in a very short period of time, leads to collapse of aquatic ecosystems. In this way, you're not getting a particular oligotrophic lake over centuries replaced by a marsh. No, you see a dead body of stinky water that is not suitable for anything. Okay, you want to see what happens when cultural eutrophication takes place? Look at this picture. This water body, as you can see, is surrounded by open soil, right? Many open fields, and definitely this is sort of an agricultural area where runoff happens continuously during rain and dumps all that fertilizers, nitrates and phosphates into this water body. And you can see it's completely green, zero transparency, no clear water. This greenish nature comes from the presence of multiple number of algae and cyanobacteria and certain photosynthetic bacteria in water. If you dip your hands in water and put it up, your hands will actually turn green because there's so much bacteria, or so much photosynthetic organisms, so much phytoplankton living in this water body. So guess what happens below this water? If the surface is like that, well, of course they will not release any oxygen during night time, and during daytime or nighttime there will be no mixing of oxygen from the atmosphere to the water, because this is like a carpet, a thick carpet of algae and cyanobacteria over the water surface. Because of this situation, there are many lakes in the United States. For example, this one over here, the Grand Lake St. Mary's, that actually have literally, well, figuratively died. How? Because nothing lives below the surface of this water body. So the lake has been contaminated through the runoff coming from many surrounding areas, feedlots, stormwater discharge, many other sources of pollution, and it dumps those non-point source pollution contaminates this water body, and it led to actually complete blooming of algae, and that resulted in death of many fish and many other organisms that who occupied the deep water column. Not only that, because of this, a lake that has been historically known for recreational activities today has become a problem. It's bad for swimming, definitely bad for drinking. Even during the times when the bloom dies, particularly like in winter or in the early spring, still that water body is unsuitable for swimming and any recreational activities, including boating. The reason is, as you can see over here, the algal bloom has made this area quite unsafe for human contact, for human touch. And also the bacterial levels in this water body is critically high, which exceeding the current standards of the state as well as the federal government. So the swimming is not advised in this piece of land.